14 board members and 2 external auditors sat around the table watching me. Nobody moved. The COO, the man who had spent the last 3 weeks making my life a quiet kind of hell, leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, waiting for me to fold. I didn't fold. I pulled my phone out of my jacket pocket, connected it to the boardroom display and pressed play. What happened next, I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. But to explain why that moment mattered, I need to take you back about 8 months. I'm 51 years old. I've spent 23 years in structural engineering and construction project management, almost all of it in Ontario. I started as a site labourer the summer after high school, worked through a civil engineering degree at Ryerson on nights and weekends, and eventually built a reputation doing things the slow, careful, unglamorous way. Checking load calculations twice, flagging non-compliant materials before they ever got poured into a foundation, writing reports that told the truth even when the truth was inconvenient. I joined Halcourt Infrastructure Group 8 years ago. Halcourt is a mid-size firm that handles public infrastructure contracts, municipal roadwork, school retrofits, provincial bridge projects. Solid company, good work. The kind of place where I thought I'd finish my career. The COO, a man I'll call my boss's boss, had been with Halcourt for about 12 years. He was well connected, sat on 2 industry association boards, golfed with the right people, knew how to work a room at a Canada infrastructure conference. Not an engineer, finance background, but sharp enough to understand that keeping certified project managers like me happy was what kept the contracts coming in. For most of my time there, we got along fine. Then his son joined the company. The kid, I'll call him the son, was 26, fresh MBA from Western. Never held a hard hat, never read a structural inspection report, never spent a day on a job site. But he arrived in October with a Director of Project Oversight title and an office 2 doors down from his father's. I was assigned to mentor him. My supervisor pulled me aside and said, "Just show him the ropes. He's eager to learn." I nodded and said nothing, because what I wanted to say, that handing a director title to someone with 0 field experience on public safety infrastructure projects was a liability waiting to happen, wasn't something I was going to say out loud on my first week working with this arrangement. I gave the son a fair shot. I really did. The first 2 months, I walked him through everything. How we read geotechnical reports, how material certification works under Ontario's building code, why you never substitute a specified structural steel grade for a cheaper equivalent without engineer of record sign-off. He nodded along, took notes sometimes, asked decent questions. But somewhere around month 3, something shifted. He stopped asking questions and started offering opinions. Then the opinions started arriving as directives. The project where everything unraveled was a pedestrian bridge rehabilitation in a mid-sized city about 2 hours west of Toronto. Provincial funding, tight timeline, public-facing. The kind of project where doing things right isn't just professional obligation. It's the difference between a bridge that stands for 30 years and one that makes the evening news for the wrong reasons. The original specs called for a specific grade of weathering steel for the primary structural members. We'd used that same spec on 4 similar projects. It has a known corrosion profile, a well-documented performance record, and it's what the engineer of record had stamped and signed. Sometime in late February, I started noticing discrepancies between our procurement orders and what was showing up on site. The steel being delivered didn't match the certified mill reports I'd approved. The grade was close, not wildly different, but it wasn't what the engineer had specified. And in structural applications, close doesn't mean anything. Tolerances exist for a reason. I went back through the purchase orders and found that someone had revised them. The revision timestamps pointed to the son's login credentials. I printed everything off that afternoon and locked it in my desk drawer at home. The next morning I requested a meeting with the son and asked him directly whether he had authorized a material substitution. He told me the original spec was over-engineered and that the alternative would save the project roughly $47,000. He said his father was aware. I told him clearly that no substitution could happen without a formal request to the engineer of record, written documentation, and sign-off from the project owner. In this case, a provincial ministry. That wasn't my opinion. That was the requirement under our construction contract and under Ontario regulation. He shrugged and told me not to make this into something bigger than it was. I left that meeting and started documenting. I want to be precise here, because what I did over the next 6 weeks was careful and deliberate. I am not a dramatic person by nature. I don't like conflict. What I do understand is that in my field, the paper trail is everything. When a structure fails, and some do, the investigation comes down to who knew what, when, and whether they acted on it. I had no intention of being on the wrong side of that question. I flagged the substitution in writing to my direct supervisor. I received a vague reply telling me to work with the team on a solution. I followed up twice. Both times, the response was non-committal. I then sent a formal written notice to the project file, dated, signed, timestamped, documenting the unauthorized substitution and my objections. I sent a copy to the company's internal quality assurance coordinator. Then I kept showing up to work, keeping my head down and recording. I want to be careful about how I describe this. I wasn't secretly wiretapping anyone. Every recording I made was of meetings I was already a participant in. Ontario is a one-party consent province, which means that if you are part of a conversation, you are legally permitted to record it. I knew this. I began recording every meeting that involved the son, my supervisor, or the COO, on any matter related to that bridge project. Over 6 weeks, I accumulated recordings of the son telling a contractor to not worry about the certification paperwork. A recording of my supervisor telling me the material substitution had been resolved at a higher level. A recording of the COO himself in a project status meeting saying that the specs were guidelines, not gospel, when I raised the issue again. That last one I listened to about 4 times afterward, sitting in my truck in the Halcourt parking lot. Guidelines, not gospel. On a public bridge, the provincial compliance audit was scheduled for the 3rd week of April. Ministry inspectors would be coming out to review documentation, certifications, and on-site conditions. It was a routine audit, the kind that happens on all provincially funded projects, but it was also the kind of thing that, if the material substitution came to light without any paper trail showing we'd caught and corrected it, would expose Halcourt to serious consequences. Possible contract termination, potential debarment from provincial bidding. In a worst case, if there was ever a structural incident, criminal liability. The week before the audit, I was called into the COO's office. His son was there. So was our HR director. The CO told me that my attitude toward the son had become a problem, that I had been dismissive, uncooperative, and that I had undermined his son's authority in front of contractors on multiple occasions. He said the son had prepared a written account of these incidents. Then he told me I needed to apologize. Not privately. In the next all-staff project meeting, scheduled for that Friday, in front of the full project team, 12 people, including junior staff and 2 contractors, he said, "You can do that, or we can have a different conversation about your future here." I sat there for a moment. The HR director wasn't looking at me. She was looking at her notepad. I asked if I could have until Friday morning to think about it. The COO said that was fine. He seemed satisfied. I think he expected me to spend those 4 days quietly resigning myself to it. I spent those 4 days differently. I called a friend of mine who had spent 15 years with the Provincial Ministry of Transportation before going into private consulting. I explained the situation in general terms without naming the company. He listened carefully and then said something I've thought about many times since. In this province, an unauthorized material substitution on a public structure isn't a paperwork problem. It's a Public Works Protection Act problem. And if it involves falsified certification documents, it becomes something else entirely. I thanked him and hung up. Then I went and looked at the procurement records again. One of the revised purchase orders included what appeared to be a retroactively altered mill certification, the document that confirms a steel product meets the specified grade. The original digital file had a creation date of December. The version in our project file had a modification date of late February. The content was different. That was no longer an internal process failure. That was document falsification on a publicly funded infrastructure project. I contacted a lawyer that Thursday evening. She specialized in construction law and had handled whistleblower cases before. She confirmed what I already suspected. I had significant protections under Ontario's occupational health and safety legislation if I was raising a safety concern in good faith. She also walked me through what I should, and shouldn't, do next. I didn't sleep much that night. My wife made tea around midnight and sat with me at the kitchen table while I organized everything into a folder. the original spec, the revised purchase orders, the modified mill cert, my written notices to the file, the email chain with my supervisor, and 4 of the most significant audio recordings, which I'd had my lawyer review. She asked me if I was sure. I told her I was sure the bridge was going to be walked across by kids on school trips and seniors going to the farmers market, and that I'd spent 23 years making sure structures like that were built to hold them. She nodded, refilled my tea, didn't say anything else. She's always understood what I do and why it matters. Friday morning arrived. The all-staff project meeting was held in our main boardroom at 9 a.m. The 14 team members were there. The 2 external auditors from the ministry, who were on site that week for the compliance audit, had been invited to observe the status portion of the meeting. That was standard practice. The COO opened the meeting. He walked through a few project updates. Then he turned to me. He said, and I remember this precisely, "Before we get into today's agenda, I want to address something. There have been some interpersonal issues on this project team that I think we need to put behind us. I've spoken with the individuals involved, and I'm asking that we clear the air this morning." He looked at me. "I think you have something you'd like to say." The room was quiet. The son was sitting 2 seats to my left, looking at his phone. I stood up. I said, "Yes, I do have something to say. But first I'd like to share something with the room, if that's all right." I connected my phone to the display system. The CEO's expression changed slightly. He said, "That's not really necessary." I pressed play. The first recording was 38 seconds. It was the COO's own voice from the project status meeting 6 weeks earlier, saying that engineering specifications on public infrastructure were guidelines, not gospel. Nobody in the room moved. The second recording was from the meeting where my supervisor told me the material substitution had been resolved at a higher level. I then brought up the procurement documents on the screen, the original purchase order, the revised version, and the 2 versions of the mill certification side by side, with the creation and modification dates clearly visible. I said, "I want to be clear about why I'm showing this. I raised concerns about an unauthorized material substitution on this project in writing 3 times over 6 weeks. Those concerns were not addressed. Instead, I was called into this room and told to publicly apologize. The ministry auditors are in the building this week. I believe they need to see what I've just shown this room." The external auditors were both leaning forward. The son had put his phone down. The HR director was still not looking at anyone. The COO said my name once, in a tone I couldn't quite read, somewhere between warning and something that sounded almost like disbelief, like he genuinely hadn't expected this. I sat down. What followed was not dramatic in the way people might imagine. There was no shouting, no one stormed out. The meeting ended about 4 minutes later, quietly and abruptly, when one of the ministry auditors asked to speak with the CO privately, and the other asked me if I could stay behind. I stayed behind. I spent the next 2.5 hours in that boardroom with the auditors, walking through every document. My lawyer arrived at 11:15 after I texted her from the hallway. She sat beside me for the rest of the process. The Provincial Ministry of Infrastructure launched a formal compliance investigation that same afternoon. Work on the bridge was suspended pending review. A third-party structural engineering firm was brought in to assess the materials already installed. The son was placed on administrative leave within the week. 3 months later, I learned through industry contacts that he had resigned. The CO, his father, was a more complicated matter. He retained his own legal counsel. There was a period of several months where I wasn't sure what would happen. Halcourt's board of directors, it turned out, had not been aware of the material substitution or the altered documentation. When they were made aware, they moved quickly. The COO was terminated for cause. The company cooperated fully with the provincial investigation. 2 findings came out of that investigation that I think about often. The first was that the structural steel substitution, while not immediately catastrophic, had used a material with inferior corrosion resistance for the application, meaning that without remediation, the bridge would have required significant rehabilitation within 12 to 15 years rather than the projected 30. The second finding was that the mill certification alteration constituted a fraudulent representation under Ontario's Construction Act. The COO and the son were both named in a civil action brought by the provincial government. The son reached a settlement. The COO's case, as of when I last checked, was still working its way through. Halcourt brought in a new COO. The board asked me to stay on. I negotiated a new contract that included a formal role in quality assurance oversight, something the company had needed for a long time but never formalized. The bridge was remediated with the correct materials. The project came in late and over budget, but it was built right. I still drive past that bridge sometimes. It's not a remarkable structure, a pedestrian crossing over a creek, a green railing, a paved surface. Most people walk over it without thinking about it. That's exactly how it should be. I kept working in this industry because the work matters. Structures hold people, roads carry families home at night. Every time I sign my name to a document, I'm putting my professional judgment and my reputation behind it. 23 years in, I haven't once regretted taking that seriously. The recording on my phone was 41 minutes in total. I played less than 4 minutes of it that Friday morning. But I had the other 37, and everyone in that room knew it.